Hello everyone. In this recording we are going to discuss what's called process costing. Now, in one of our previous lectures we talked about job costing. And process costing is a little different than, it's actually a lot different, job costing and process costing. The difference is the type of manufacturing that we are doing. As an example from the prior studies when we discussed job costing, we were dealing with manufactured items that were very unique to the individual order from the customer. As an example, we made a house that was specific to the particular customer. Certain model, certain kitchen cabinets, flooring, everything was pretty unique to that individual unit. And they were all different. Job costing is what we studied. Versus in this chapter, I am going to teach you what is known as process costing. Now with process costing, that is when we are manufacturing identical items for our customers. An example, and I like to use this example, I don't know why, but tubes of toothpaste. We're in the Colgate manufacturing plant and we're making, a particular tube of toothpaste. They are all going to come off the assembly line exactly the same. When I go into the store and buy the tube of toothpaste, I am picking up the same type of tube that you are. So that would be an example. Or boxes of cereal, another example. So you get the idea. So process costing, masses of identical units are produced. And so we're going to use a different system, process costing. Okay, once again, because process costing is dealing with items of inventory that are exactly the same, we are basically going to assign all of the costs in the same manner. So remember the manufacturing cost, the inventoriable cost, as we said. There's really three of them. We've got direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. So basically with process costing in a nutshell, the same amount of direct materials, direct labor, and overhead is going to be assigned to each individual unit. So in that respect, it's actually a little bit simpler to understand than job costing, at least the theory behind it. Okay, so let's take a look at three different scenarios. All right, so the first one is when we are starting our month or our accounting period with no beginning work in process. That means physically the assembly line is empty. So we started the month, let's say it's February 1st, and we look at the assembly line, it is completely empty. So we're starting with no beginning work in process. Now, on the same lines of that thinking, at the end of the month, we look at the assembly line and the assembly line is completely empty. That means there's no ending work in process. So that's probably the easiest of all three when we look at these cases. There's no beginning or ending work in process. In other words, with number one, what is happening is all of the costs, the materials, labor, and overhead that were added to the month on the assembly line are going to be transferred to finished goods because these are items that not only started during the month, they ended as well during the month. So with number one, effectively what we're saying is all of the costs are assigned to what we made during the month. It's real easy. Number two gets a little bit trickier. We're still going to assume with situation number two or case number two that there's no beginning work in process. But at the end of the month, there is some ending work in process. So you're going to see with number two, we're going to need to do some assignment of costs at the end of the month versus, between which items moved on to the finished goods versus which items are still remaining in the work in process. And number three, of course, is the trickiest of all three cases. This is when we have both beginning and ending work in process inventories, and we need to move those costs along. So let's take a look. Case number one, like I said, no beginning, no ending work in process. It's pretty simple. That means there's really all the costs that were basically spent during the month are going to be assigned to the units that we made, and we moved on to finished goods. Real simple. I don't even think I need to give you some math for that. It's pretty simple. Well, moving on to allocating costs in a process costing situation. This slide here, the 5 steps, is critically important. So I need you guys to really zone in on these 5 steps. And we're going to practice these 5 steps when we go through a couple more cases here. Okay, step number 1. We're going to basically summarize the flow of physical units of output. So with number 1, we're not talking about costs. We're talking about the actual units. So let me give you an example. We had 2 units in beginning inventory, and we added 5 units during the month, and 4 units were moved on and completely transferred to finished goods. And there was a few items left in ending inventory. That's what I mean about summarizing the flow of units. What was in beginning inventory plus what was started during the month minus what was transferred over to finished goods equals what's left in ending work in process. Number 2, we are going to compute output in terms of equivalent units. Now, this term equivalent units is going to be very important. With equivalent units, basically what we're going to do is convert physical units to equivalent units. And how would we convert physical units to equivalent units? Well, basically with equivalent units, the reason why they're different than physical units is because we need to estimate what percentage each unit is complete in terms of materials and labor and overhead. So I can say a certain unit at the end of the month is 100% done with materials, but it's only, let's say, 60% done with labor and overhead. So in order to convert physical units to equivalent units, we're going to multiply it by its percentage already completed. And number 3, this is the first time we're going to actually summarize the costs. So the actual material costs, labor costs, overhead costs. And now that we know total costs and we know equivalent units, we can now compute the cost per equivalent unit. And once we've computed the cost per equivalent unit, we can then assign costs to either items that are still remaining in ending work in process, or they moved on to finished goods. So once again, and I know I'm just saying a bunch of words right now, but I'm going to show you in the next slides how to actually do this. But once again, very important, this 5-step process is key to this whole chapter. Okay, so here is an example of case number 2 where we have no beginning work in process, but we have ending work in process. So take a look at this slide. You will see in column B, you see in column B, row 1, it says step number 1. So remember, step number 1 from our 5-step process is summarize the flow of physical units. So let's take a look at column B. This is summarizing the flow. The beginning work in process, we had 0 units. So that means we had an empty assembly line at the beginning of the period. And we started 400 units during the period. So if I had 0 in beginning WIP and I started 400 during the period, that means I need to account for 400 units. I need to account for 400 units. Okay, so the accounting for the 400 units is as follows. I know that I have 175 units that were transferred to the finished goods at the end of the period. Therefore, if I had 400 to account for and 175 were transferred out, that means 225 units are in ending work in process. So that is something that is very, very important to understand. We're going to account for all 400 as follows. Okay, now step 2 is to compute, basically convert the physical units, the 400 physical units, convert them to equivalent units. And you can see we have 2 columns here. We have direct materials and we have conversion costs. So 175 units, like I said, were completed and they were transferred to the finished goods during the period. Well, because they are completely 100% done and there was no beginning WIP, that means 175 physical units are also the equivalent units for both materials and the conversion costs. Remember from a previous study, conversion costs are both labor and overhead combined. So we're going to show them combined because they're added at the same time. Now the ending work in process are 225 physical units. They are on the assembly line somewhere, somehow at the end of the period. Now, in our estimation, 100% of the materials have been added to these 225 units. So our equivalent units would be 225 times 100%, also 225. But conversion costs, based on our estimation, only 60% of the labor and overhead have been added to these 225 units somewhere on the assembly line. So if we take the 225 and multiply it by 60%, that gives us our equivalent unit for conversion costs. So if we add what was completed plus what was on the assembly line at the end of the period, if we add those two up, we will get our equivalent units. Our equivalent units for materials are 400, and our equivalent units for conversion costs, once again the labor and overhead, is 310. So that was step 2, basically computing the equivalent units. And once again, 400 equivalent units for materials, 310 for conversion costs. Okay, step 3. Step 3 is when we are going to accumulate all of our costs. Because we had no beginning WIP, the only costs that we need to account for are the ones added during the current month. And they totaled $50,600. That $50,600 is $32,000 in materials and $18,600 in your conversion, your labor and your overhead. If we take the $32,000 for direct materials and divide it by our equivalent units of 400 that we just calculated on the prior slide, we get our cost per equivalent unit. This is step 4. Over on the conversion cost, it was total cost of $18,600. But remember from the prior slide, the equivalent units were only 310, not 400. Let me go back just quickly to show you. You remember? The 400 is the equivalent units for materials, but 310 is the equivalent unit for the conversion costs. So if we take 18,600 divided by 310, we get 60. So that's our cost per equivalent unit. And the last step in the process is to assign the costs. So remember, there were 400 units to be accounted for. 175 were completed and transferred out. So we're going to take that 175 and multiply it by the 80, which is the cost per equivalent unit, plus 175 times 60 for conversion. If you do the math, we're going to assign $24,500 of the costs to what was transferred out to finished goods. And what's remaining in the WIP process, and remember we calculated 225 units were basically somewhere on the WIP line. So direct materials, 225 times 80, plus the conversion costs, 135. How come 135 and not 225? Once again, remember we have to deal with not the physical units, but the equivalent units. So 225 for materials, 135 for the conversion costs. So we'll take the equivalent units times the cost per equivalent unit. When you do the math, you get that you've accounted for the entire $50,600 that we needed to account for. $24,500 was transferred out to finished goods. 26,100 is remaining in the work in process, the WIP inventory. So this is case number 2, where we had no beginning inventory, no beginning WIP inventory, but we had some ending WIP inventory. And once again, we needed to do the allocation and show which costs move on to the finished goods and which costs remain here in the work in process. Here you can see it in the journal entry flow. So going back to the last slide real quickly, we saw that $32,000 of costs were added in materials and $18,600 were added during February. So that was the first numbers, the amounts that went into the WIP inventory account. All right, and when we figure it out at the end of the month, how much of the $50,600 transferred out? $24,500 transferred out of the WIP stage. So we will credit the WIP inventory and we will debit either the next WIP stage or debit finished goods. There might be a second stage, and in this example, it looks like there's a WIP stage 2. So we have an assembly process, and then we have a testing process. And we'll do it once again. We'll go through the WIP stage of testing and then ultimately transfer it out to finished goods, and then ultimately selling it and transferring it to the cost of goods sold account on the income statement. All right, so that is case number 2, where we have no beginning WIP inventory, but we had ending WIP inventory, and we needed to determine which cost remained in the WIP account and which cost got transferred out of the WIP account, which we just did, which was the $24,500. Okay, now when we have ending WIP inventory, okay, and beginning WIP inventory, we need to decide whether we are going to use the weighted average method or the FIFO method. So process costing, we're going to use both, either weighted average or FIFO method. This is obviously important when we have case number 3, when we have both beginning inventory and ending WIP, beginning WIP inventory and ending WIP inventory. Okay, so here is the example given to us. First, remember, step 1. Step 1 is summarizing our physical units. So in this example, we had beginning WIP of 225 units. So we're dealing with the next month. Remember, at the end of the prior month, we ended with 225 units in ending WIP. So that is going to be the beginning WIP for the next month, 225. So 225 plus we started another 275 units during the month. So if you add the two up, we need to account for 500 units. Well, out of the 500 units, I know 400 units were transferred out to the next stage, okay, whether that next stage is another WIP stage or finished goods. And that means if I have 500 to account for, and if I know 400 were transferred off to the next stage, that means 100 are remaining here in ending WIP. So that is accounting for the physical units. Step 2 in our process is to convert the physical units to equivalent units. Well, if I completed and transferred 400 units out, that means they are 100% done in terms of materials and labor and overhead. So we'll take the 400 times 100% to calculate equivalent units for materials, as well as equivalent units for conversion, which is labor and overhead. Now, the 100 items that are remaining here in the WIP stage at the end of the period, I am estimating that they are 100% done with adding materials. So we will take the 100 physical units times 100% to give us the equivalent units for direct materials. And our estimation is that these 100 units are only 50% complete for adding labor and overhead. So we will take the 100 physical units times that 50%, our estimate deemed completed for conversion cost. So our equivalent units for materials is 500, and our equivalent units for conversion cost is 450. Remember the 500 and the 450. These are our equivalent units. So step 3. Remember, step 3 is to now summarize the costs. Well, if you go back a couple of slides, you will see that the ending WIP had $26,100 in it. And then we're going to do is we know that that makes up 18,000 materials and 8,100 conversion costs. And what did we add during the period? We added an additional $36,180 of costs. And we see the breakdown between materials and conversion costs. So we need to account for a total of 62,280 costs. 37,800 for materials. We will divide it by equivalent units for materials that we calculated in step 2. That gives us our cost per equivalent unit, $75.60. Conversion costs, total of $24,480 to account for, divided by the equivalent units for conversion costs that we calculated in step 2 of 450. That gives us our cost per equivalent unit of $54.40. So, direct materials, how do I assign the amounts, the 37,800? Well, remember, from the prior step, we said the 500 units, 400 completely transferred out, 100 are in WIP. Conversion, 400 completely transferred out, 50 equivalent units still in ending WIP. So the 400 times the 75.60, the cost per equivalent unit for completed and transferred out, or 100 equivalent units times the 75.60 of what's remaining in ending WIP. The conversion costs, completed and transferred out, 400 equivalent units times the cost per equivalent unit of $54.40. And the ending WIP, 50 was the equivalent units in ending WIP from step 2 times your $54.40. Anyway, you do your math. You've accounted for the $62,280 as follows. $52,000 got transferred to the next step, whether that's another WIP stage or the finished goods, and $10,280 is remaining here in ending WIP. So this is the weighted average, all right, with case 3, where we have beginning WIP and ending WIP, using weighted average to account for those costs and how we assign them. The other method is called FIFO. And if you remember from your principles accounting class, FIFO stands for first in and first out. So let's take a look at the numbers. Once again, step 1, basically summarizing the flow of the physical units. Well, once again, you will notice that we started with 225 units in beginning WIP. We started another 275 units during the period. So we need to account for 500 units. Now you will see with FIFO, what we need to do is we need to figure, okay, the 400 units that were actually completed and transferred out during the period, that's what we need to account for, these 400. But with the FIFO, we need to say the 400 units that were transferred out, 225 came from the beginning WIP, and the other 175 were actually started during this period and also completed during the period. If you add the 225 and the 175, that equates to the 400 units that were finished during the month. So if 400 were finished and transferred out during the month, and we need to account for 500, that means the remaining 100 are an ending WIP. That is step 1, just making sure we understand the physical flow of the units. Step 2, we are now going to convert those physical units to equivalent units. Okay, so 225 units were finished during the month, and they came from beginning WIP. Okay, now remember, the beginning WIP had all of its direct materials added in the prior stage. Therefore, in the current stage, no new direct materials were added to those 225 units that were started in the prior period. So we're going to say 225 times 0% or 0. Now, if we look back, these 225 units were 60% complete, all right, at the end of the prior period for conversion costs. That means in the current period, the additional 40% were added. If I take the 225 times 40%, that gives me 90 as the equivalent unit conversion. Well, the other 175 physical units were started and completed during this period. Now, because they were started and completed during this period, that means 100% of the materials and 100% of the costs were added during this period. So we'll take 175 physical units times 100%, and we will convert to equivalent units for both materials as well as your conversion, your labor and your overhead. And last but not least, the 100 units somewhere on the assembly line at the end of the period. Well, 100% of our materials have already been added to these 100 units. So we'll take the 100 units times 100% to calculate the equivalent units for materials. And as we said earlier, they are 50% complete in terms of adding labor and overhead. So we'll take the 100 times 50% to get the equivalent units for conversion. So the total equivalent units for direct materials is 275, and the total equivalent units for conversion cost is 315. Remember the 275 and the 315 and the makeup of the 275 and the 315 as we move on to step 3 and 4 and 5, which are here. So step 3 is just accumulating all of the costs. Now remember, the beginning WIP, which was given to us, is $26,100. We are adding $36,180 of costs in the current period, and we can see the breakup of those between materials and your conversion, your labor and your overhead. So we need to account for $62,280. That is step 3, just accumulating all the costs we need to account for. Step 4, we are going to compute the cost per equivalent unit for work done in the current period. So for the direct materials, what costs were added during the current period? $19,800. So if we take that and divide it by our cost per equivalent, our equivalent units that we calculated in step 2 of 275, we get $72. For conversion costs, the amounts added during the current period, $16,380, divided by your equivalent units that we calculated in step 2 of 315, that gives us our cost per equivalent unit of 52. Okay, now step 5 is we are going to assign our $62,280 of costs. First, beginning WIP, well, we've already assigned it, $18,000 for direct materials, $8,100 for conversion. Now, costs added during the current periods. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our equivalent unit, step 2. Remember, we said from beginning WIP, 0%, started and completed, 175, and ending WIP, 100. So 0, 175, and 100. Those are our equivalent units when we will multiply times our cost per equivalent unit of 72. 0 times 72, new costs added to the WIP period. 175 times 72, that is started and completed during the period. And 100 times 72, that is the ending work in process. Now the conversion costs, our beginning WIP costs were $8,100. Now what was added during the period? We're going to use conversion costs. Equivalent unit is 90 175, and 50. Remember these numbers, 90, 175, and 50. So the cost added to the beginning WIP, we're going to use 90 equivalent unit times the cost per equivalent unit of 52. Started and completed, 175 was the equivalent unit times the cost per equivalent unit was 52. And your ending WIP, the equivalent unit was 50 times 52 is the cost per equivalent unit. Well, when you do all of the math, you will find that we accounted for the $62,280. This is basically the beginning WIP plus the cost added to the beginning WIP plus what was started and completed during the period plus what remains in ending WIP. So the $9,800 remains in ending WIP, and all the other costs are graduating to the next step, whether that's another finished goods, that's another WIP stage, or it's finished goods. That's the next step. So you can see when we use FIFO, there's a little bit more of a complicated matter because we need to take care of the units that were actually finished. We need to decide those units that were finished and moved on to the next stage. How much of those units that were finished came from beginning WIP and how much were started and completed all in the same month. So that's a little bit of a wrinkle there with FIFO process costing when we have beginning and ending WIP. Okay, and really the last subject matter that I want to talk to you about in this chapter is when we do have a secondary WIP stage and we're moving from one WIP stage to another WIP stage. What we're going to see is that we have transferred in costs from the first WIP stage to the next WIP stage. Those transferred in costs are also called previous department costs. And we're going to show a journal entry to move the cost along from one WIP inventory account to the next WIP inventory account. Transferred in costs are treated as like a separate direct material that are added at the beginning of the process. So that means all the transferred in costs, basically they are 100% completed by the time the next WIP stage starts. Okay, that's the best way to think about it. So let's take a look at an example using first weighted average when we have transferred in costs, and then we'll take a look at an example using FIFO when we have transferred in costs. So here's the example. Step one, remember, step one is basically summarizing the flow of the physical units. So based on this example, we had 240 units that were in work in process from the last stage, all right? And it's basically being brought into the next stage. And what were transferred in during the current period? So we had 240 in beginning WIP, and 400 units were transferred in during the current period. So that was basically not at the beginning of the month, but sometime during the month, we had additional 400 items that were brought into this WIP stage. Okay, so we need to account for a total of 640 units. Now, I know out of the 640 units, I know that 440 units were completely finished with this WIP stage during the month. So if I have to account for 640 and 440 were actually finished with this WIP stage during the month, that means the additional 200 are on the assembly line somewhere at the end of the month. Now, because these 440 units were completed during the month, that means they are 100% equivalent units for transferred in cost and materials and conversion. Remember, conversion is your labor and your overhead. Now the 200 items in ending WIP, they are 100% complete in terms of transferred in costs. Remember, the transferred in costs are basically the costs coming from the previous WIP stage. So it makes sense they're 100% complete for transferred in costs. But in this WIP stage, these 200 items in ending WIP, we haven't added any direct materials yet in this WIP stage, so they are 0% complete for direct materials. 200 times 0% equals 0. And conversion costs, we estimate that 80% of all the labor and the overhead for this current WIP stage is already complete. So to convert your 200 physical units, we will multiply it by the percent complete, 80%, to get you to the conversion. The equivalent units for the conversion costs. So 640 physical units, but equivalent units, 640 for transferred in costs, 440 for direct materials, 600 for conversion costs. Now we move on to step 3. Step 3 is when we simply accumulate all of our costs that we need to account for. Well, the beginning WIP, $51,600, is coming from the beginning WIP. We saw that earlier, and we're adding $113,800 in new costs that are coming in. And we can see the breakdown of the $113,800. $52,000 is transferred in from the prior WIP stage. We're adding $13,200 in new direct materials, and we're adding $48,600 in new conversion costs. So we got our total cost that we need to account for. And what we will do is we will take those total costs to account for, and we will divide it by the equivalent units that we calculated in step 2. The equivalent units for transferred in costs were 640. So $85,600 divided by 640 gives us our cost per equivalent unit, $133.75. For direct materials, we need to account for $13,200 divided by your equivalent units that we accounted in step 2 of 440. For direct materials, that gives us $30 as our cost per equivalent unit for direct materials. And lastly, your conversion, we're going to account for $66,600 divided by our equivalent units that we calculated in step 2 of 600. That gives us our cost per equivalent unit of 111. We will now assign our costs. Remember, we need to assign $165,400. How much of this was transferred out and how much of this is remaining in the ending WIP? What we're going to do is we will take the amount of what was completed and transferred out. We can go back to step 2 and you can see out of the 640 equivalent units, 440 was completed and transferred out, 200 was in ending WIP. So we will take those equivalent units and multiply it by the cost per equivalent unit. How much of it was completed and transferred out? 440 times 133.75. And how much is remaining in ending WIP? 200 times 133.75. Direct materials. Going back a slide. Equivalent units for completed and transferred out, 440. How about ending WIP? 0. So if we take those, the 440 and the 0, and we multiply it by the cost per equivalent unit of 30, we're going to assign those costs appropriately. And last but not least, conversion costs. You can see our equivalent units is 440 for completed and transferred out, 160 for ending WIP. So we'll take the 440 and the 160 and multiply it against our cost per equivalent unit. Anyway, you do the math, $165,400 has been accounted for, as was what we were supposed to per step 3. And we know $120,890 is basically being transferred out, which is the transferred in costs plus the direct materials plus the conversion costs that were assigned to the items that were transferred out. And the ending WIP, $44,510. All right, that's going to basically remain in ending WIP. So we'll make a journal entry to move this $120,890 along to the next stage. So yes, sometimes when we have additional WIP stages and we need to account for the transferred in costs. And once again, think of the transferred in costs as basically direct materials that were added, at the beginning of the stage, and basically 100%, added when it came in from the prior stage. And last but not least, let's do the same thing when we have transferred in costs, but instead of using the weighted average method, we are going to use the FIFO method. So the same 640 units to account for. 240 units were in the beginning WIP, and we started, or transferred in, I should say, 400 additional units during the month from the previous WIP stage. So that's a total of 640 units I need to account for. And so what we're going to say is, we know that 404, if you remember from our prior example, 440 units out of the 640, 440 units were completed during this period. So out of the 440 that were completed, since it's FIFO, first in, first out, we know 240 of the 440 came from beginning WIP that was done, and another 200 were started and completed both during this month, and the remaining 200 units were an ending WIP. They were somewhere along the assembly line at the end of the period. So that's step one, basically just showing the flow of the physical units. Step two is to convert these physical units to equivalent units. And once again, we have to calculate equivalent units for transferred in costs plus direct materials plus conversion, which are labor and overhead. Transferred in costs, once again, are those costs that were added during the prior period. And so, first, from beginning WIP, we had 240 units. Well, because the transferred in costs were 100% allocated to the beginning WIP, that means in the current period, 0% of the transferred in costs will be added to the period. So added to this in this period. So 240 times 0% is 0. In the prior period, we saw that 0% of the direct materials were added to the WIP stage, were added to the beginning WIP. Therefore, 100% of the direct materials for these beginning WIP items of 240 are added during the current period. So we'll say 240 times 100% gives us 240. And in the prior period, the estimate was 62.5% of the labor and the overhead were added to these 240 units in WIP in the prior stage. So that means in the current stage, 37.5% of the labor and overhead were added additionally to these 240 units. So if I take 240 times 37.5%, I will get 90. Now the 200 units that were started and completed both during the current period, that means 100% of the costs were added during the period. So if we take the 200 times 100% across the board, so basically the equivalent units are the same as the physical units. And last but not least, the 200 physical units in the ending WIP, we know 0% of the costs for transferred in were added during the old period, so they were all added during the current period, 200 times 100%. The direct materials, okay, they are 0% complete, were added during the current process. The materials are going to be added in the next month. So 200 times 0%. And the conversion costs, we feel that they are 80% done by the end of the month. So these 200 physical units times 80%, we will get the 160. So how about equivalent units for transferred in costs? 400 for direct materials, 440, and for conversion costs, 450. Once again, 400, 440, and 450. That will be needed when we get to our next steps. Step 3, once again, is just to summarize all of the costs that we need to account for. which we have here. Our beginning WIP was given to us, $33,600 were the transferred in costs. Direct materials in the beginning WIP were 0. We're adding them all in the current period, and $18,000 conversion costs. And we added $114,280 broken down as follows: $52,480 transferred in from the prior period. The prior step, I should say, not the prior period, the prior step. $13,200 new direct materials, and $48,000 new conversion costs. So we need to account for $165,880. Step 4 is basically calculating cost per equivalent unit. So what we're going to do for all three types of costs, transferred in costs, the direct materials, and the conversion costs, we're going to take the new cost added during the current period, $52,480, divided by the equivalent units that we calculated in step 2 to give us our cost per equivalent unit. So for transferred in cost, it's the $52,480 are the new cost added during the period, divided by the equivalent units that we calculated in step 2, equals our cost per equivalent unit of $131.20. Direct materials, the cost added during the period, $13,200, divided by the equivalent units established in step 2, gives us our cost per equivalent unit of $30. And lastly, your conversion cost added during the period, $48,600, divided by your equivalent units calculated in step 2 of 450. It'll give us our cost per equivalent unit of 108. And now we will take these cost per equivalent units and multiply them by the actual equivalent units to assign our costs of $165,880. First, the beginning WIP. That was from step 3, the $51,600. $33,600 transferred in, 0 direct materials, $18,000 conversion costs. It's basically row 2. Now, cost added during the period. We need to go back to step 2 and look at our equivalent units. It's 0, 200, and 200. These three numbers, 0, 200, and 200. We are going to use them and multiply them against our cost per equivalent unit of $131.20 to calculate the cost added to beginning WIP plus the started and completed plus what gets assigned to ending WIP. You'll do the same thing with direct materials and conversion costs. So for direct materials, the equivalent units are 240, 200, and 0. Once again, 240, 200, and 0. And so when we assign them, 240 to cost added to the beginning WIP times the equivalent units of cost per equivalent unit of 30. There's the 200, started and completed, and 0. Direct materials to the ending WIP. Nothing. We didn't add any yet. And last but not least, conversion costs. Our equivalent units are 90, 200, and 160. Once again, 90, 200, and 160. And so we will use those equivalent units, the 90, the 200, and the 160. You can see I'm down here with my cursor in column H. Multiply it by the cost per equivalent unit that we calculated up here in row 8. And we will basically assign the costs. So if we add everything up, we've accounted for the entire $165,880. Basically, $43,520 is remaining in ending WIP. That means the other amounts, $122,360, will graduate and move on to the next step. Okay, so those are the cases with process costing. The easiest is when we have no beginning and no ending WIP. The next case, which was case 2, is when we had no beginning WIP, but we had ending WIP. And case 3, which is probably the most complex, is when we have a portion of our cost assigned to beginning WIP and a portion of our cost assigned to ending WIP. And when we have case number 3, we need to determine whether we're going to use weighted average or if we're going to use FIFO. And last but not least, in addition, if we have 2 WIP stages, where we've got WIP stage 1 and WIP stage 2, we need to account for the flow of transferred in costs from the prior WIP stage into the current WIP stage.